completely blow up, several hundred Finnish Jews who were living in Finland happily joined in with the Finnish army and fought with the Nazis against the Russians. Now that's just, at this point, you got to throw your hands up in the air and say, how are we ever going to hold trials to hold some people to account for some of this stuff? This Finnish war continued on right until the end of World War II, when Roosevelt, actually it was Truman at the time, and Churchill sent a very, very long and nasty message to the Finns that said that if they were going to continue fighting against the Russians, that post-war Finland was going to be treated just like post-war Germany. And that finally got the Finns and the Russians to stop fighting with each other at the end of the war. So now to further complicate matters, when Germany and Russia attacked Poland, another German ally, guess who? The Italians launched a war in North Africa and Albania. Now, we're just not even started in this, and it's already so complicated. Anyhow, Stalin said that if the Allies want Russian participation in the Nuremberg trials, then absolutely no Russians could be charged. Well, how about some Italians? Unfortunately, the Italians complicated things because they switched sides in the middle of the war and they joined the Allies in fighting the Germans. You remember that when we invaded Italy? Another sticky mess because the British and Americans at that time, at the end of the war, didn't want to do anything in Italy that would push the Italians into the Soviet camp because communism in Europe was becoming a big thing. This was already a huge issue in Greece, where the communists were pushing for Greece to align with the Soviets rather than the West. Stopping Russian expansion was becoming a major consideration. So, no Italians would be tried. Well, how about some Croats? We talked a couple of weeks ago when I was talking about the Holocaust that the Croats ran their own camp called Jasenovac. Well, sorry. Tito was taking over Yugoslavia and he was allied with who? The Russians. And the Russians weren't going to allow that. So, no Croats. They're off limits. Okay, well, how about some of the collaborating Vichy French who happily rounded up and shipped off thousands of Jews to their death? Sorry. De Gaulle would have nothing of it. The Vichy scourge would be swept under the rug by de Gaulle in favor of a better story of heroic French resisting the Boche in the French underground. Never mind that 99.9% of those heroic French that fought the Boche and the Nazi and the French resistance only joined the French resistance the night before liberation. So the Vichy were off the hook. So the de facto answer became Germans only. Well, small problem. Based on what I already just told you at the start of this, how do you suppose the Germans felt about that? They said, I thought this was about justice, and now it's Germans only. So the Germans, of course, rightfully so perhaps, said, this is really not justice, it's Victor's justice. And you know, they still think that. And maybe they have a point, and maybe some of you have a point about that too. Just to prove my point, the Germans don't even refer to the trials as a trial. They don't call it the Nuremberg trials. They call it the Nuremberg process. They have a word in German for justice, or trials, and it's not process. This is the Palace of Justice, where the trials took place in Nuremberg. Some of you I know have been there. There's an enormous sign in front of the palace that declares this for all to see. But we're not going to get bogged down in this whole idea of the situation with respect to what the Germans call it. You can see right here, this is the sign out front. And it says, Nuremberg process. Now in English, right, for the visitors who are coming from the United States or Britain, oh, well, it says trials. But the Germans see it as a process. So they're already telling you what they think. But we're not going to get bogged down, we're carrying on. So the four victorious allies, the US, Russia, Britain, and France, agreed to this international military tribunal to be held at this Palace of Justice in Nuremberg. It's a beautiful building that was miraculously survived the endless bombing in Nuremberg. And this is what the courtroom looked like. This is courtroom 63 in that building. What it looked like in 1945, 1946. The courts that were set up there were going to be bound by international law and the law of war, and we're going to come back to this. But you can visit there today. Of course, it doesn't quite look like this. It looks like this. That's what it looks like today. It's a modern courtroom. It's like the Travis County Courthouse, I guess. I haven't been in there, but you know, it's just a municipal courtroom that they use for the area there. And let's see, there's a photo here of them both interposed, and you can actually see which parts were maintained. So this decorative door and this decoration is actually that door and that decoration, and this fancy decoration here and the door underneath it is really this door. So this was where the criminals were sitting, the people that were charged were sitting, which happens to be this part of the courtroom here. So that's what it is. Anyway, in the end, there were a number of trials that occurred in this courtroom, but the first trial that occurred here was before the International Military Tribunal, and it's the best known of all the trials, and it was the only trial that was done before the judges from all of the four main allies. That's the only one. The movie that you saw, Justice at Nuremberg, was actually another trial. That was a trial about the judges who had been active in Germany, and we're going to get to that. But that was not before an international tribunal of judges from multiple countries. That was just before, I think, an American judge. On trial at the original trial, the main trial, were the main Nazis, including members of the political, military, judicial, and economic leadership. Basically, those who planned, carried out, and otherwise participated in starting the war, and those responsible for the Holocaust and all the many other war crimes that occurred during the war. But again, there's a caveat to this. This courtroom only had 22 seats in the dock. You could only fit 22 people. And the four powers didn't want to drag this on indefinitely. So what did they do? They said to the prosecutors, pick the worst of the bunch, and that would have to be good enough. Isn't that an interesting way to pick the number of defendants? 22 chairs, 22 defendants. What about the thousands of others? Okay, remember, we're not getting bogged down by inconvenient problems here. The trial took 11 months and ran between November 20th of 1945 and October 1st of 1946. So the prosecutors first created a list of the worst surviving 24 Nazis. And we're going to run through them because it's a little interesting. They needed a few spares, and that's an interesting aspect of this. Let's talk about that a little bit. Among the 24 was Martin Bormann, but he had disappeared at the end of the war. He was tried in absentia, and so no seat was required. Okay, and then somehow they realized that one guy, Gustav Krupp, the CEO of Krupp AG, a huge industrial conglomerate that used hundreds of thousands of slave laborers to build weapons, had been in a coma since 1941. Huh? Now, how does a guy like that get on a list of defendants? Somehow his name made the list, when it turns out they really wanted his son, Alfred. Now, they didn't make this list up in an hour, right? They didn't have 10 minutes to make up this list, so there had to be some political reason, which is completely unexplained in history. But anyway, they put the father on trial. The father was in a coma. Needless to say, he was not tried, and now they were down to 22. Now Alfred, his son, probably thought he dodged a bullet, but no such luck. He ended up getting his very own trial. We're going to talk about that one a little later. Another of the indicted, a guy by the name of Robert Ley, who was head of the German Labor Front, well, he conveniently decided to commit suicide right as the trial started. So they actually ended up with 21 defendants. Let's just go through them, because some of them are quite interesting, and you may recognize some of them from history. So we talked about Bormann. Karl Dönitz was the head of the Navy. Hans Frank, governor in Poland between 1939 and 1945. He also was an author of the Nuremberg laws in 1936. This Hans Frisch guy worked for Goebbels as a radio commentator, and people were so angry at him because the Allies could hear him on the radio as they were fighting their way across Europe. So he made the list. Wilhelm Frick, Minister of Interior and a co-author of the Nuremberg trials. He turned out to be a governor in Czechoslovakia at one point. Walter Funk, the head of the Reichsbank, banker who was in charge of the economics of the Nazi party. And he succeeded another guy named Schacht, who also was on this list on the next page. So Hermann Göring, of course you've heard of him, the head of the Air Force and the highest ranking Nazi on trial, the number 2 man in the Nazi Empire behind Hitler. Rudolf Hess, this is the name of a guy who you might recall flew to Scotland in 1941 to try to negotiate some kind of peace with the British, but he was Hitler's deputy before the war. Jodl, who worked at the OKW, which was the sort of the general staff that the German army had. Now, he signed the Commissar Order. Let's talk about the Commissar Order right now. When they started the war and headed into Russia, the Germans made a fatal mistake when it comes to being tried after the war. They decided that it would be a good idea, because they wanted to do it, to murder captured Russian POWs who were commissars or political officers. In the Russian army, every unit had political officers in it, which was there to make sure that the Russian regular army would fight. And the commissars were these sort of brutal overseers who would take names and kick, you know what, if they felt that a certain Russian soldier wasn't attacking with enough vim and vigor. But the Germans decided that they would execute these people summarily. So they wrote an order at the highest levels of the German government, in fact it was written at the OKW, that it was okay to murder men in uniform. A very bad plan when the Germans had agreed before the war, we're going to talk about that prisoners of war had certain rights, and one of them was that you don't murder prisoners of war. But they did with this Commissar Order, and this is the one thing that got almost all these people executed at the end of the war, was anyone who touched that Commissar Order was in serious trouble. And one of the other guys who touched that Commissar Order was the Chief of Staff, William Keitel. And Keitel also took it in the neck for that very same thing. Also on trial was Ernst Kaltenbrunner, probably a name you don't know, but he was a big high-ranking Nazi SS guy on trial. He was also in charge of the Einsatz group, which were the groups that went into Russia behind the German army and slaughtered the masses. And Konstantin von Neurath was the foreign minister in the early to late 30s. He also became a governor before Heydrich in Czechoslovakia, but he resigned in 1943, got into a fight with Hitler, and resigned in 1943. Franz von Papen, who was vice chancellor in 1933 and 34 and an ambassador to Turkey. Franz von Papen and Hindenburg, when Hitler was coming to power, they sort of decided that they would try to let Hitler, we'll let Hitler take over, he'll probably fail in a year, and that'll be the end of him. So he sort of miscalculated and ultimately was significantly responsible for allowing Hitler to come to power when he came to power in 1933. Erich Raeder was the head of the Navy before Donitz and had worked on the U-boat strategy. Von Ribbentrop was the foreign minister who made all the deals with Italy, Japan, and Russia. This guy, Alfred Rosenberg, was responsible for the racial theories that cleaned out the Eastern Territories. And he was also a minister in the Eastern Territories in 41 to 45. Fritz Sauckel was the head of the slave labor program. And this Hjalmar Schacht was the economics minister that before the other guy, the banker from the previous page. He quit in 1938. Now, he was imprisoned after the July 44th coup attempt to kill Hitler. And he was outraged, maybe rightly so, that they tried him at Nuremberg. But this was the one individual that was really outraged for having been put into the dock because he had turned on Hitler to the point where they had imprisoned him after July 44th and were threatening to kill him until the end of the war. At the end of the war, he spent the remaining year at the end of the war in many different camps, and he ended up on a bus that this guy named Kaltenbrunner had at the end of the war, which went into the Alps. Kaltenbrunner was trying to save his neck, and he had a bunch of hostages, high-ranking Germans like Schacht, who he was holding as hostage, and he was trying to trade their lives for his life to the Allies. So he put them all on a bus and took them all up into the Alps. It's actually a very interesting story, and when I give you a list of movies to watch at the end of this presentation, one of them is about Kaltenbrunner's bus. It's really quite an interesting story. And then a couple of other characters, this Walter von Schurach, who was head of the Hitler Youth Program and also head of the Lebensborn program. Somebody was talking with me before we started today about Norway. And I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but the SS got it into their heads that they needed more blonde-haired, blue-eyed German kids who could grow up to be blonde-haired, blue-eyed German Nazis, and what better way than to get those than to make them. So they took people in the SS, men in the SS, and hooked them up with Aryan-looking girls in various countries, most notably in Norway, and they started having children. Now, it wasn't just Norway where they got the girls. They got the girls, any girl that they ran into, actually, that looked Aryan, was good enough for them. So this program grew to be quite big. Now, there's a very famous person who's actually one of these Lebensborn people. Now, I think this, well, I know that this person was active in my lifetime, but there's a very famous singer who is a Lebensborn. Does anybody have any idea who that is?
Marlene Dietrich?
Who?
Marlene Dietrich?
Too old. No. Many of you have heard of the group ABBA, right? One of the two girls, not the blonde, is actually a Lebensborn. And her mother and her were hounded out of Norway at the end of the war. They actually moved to Sweden. They lived most of their lives in Sweden, and that's where she grew up as sort of an outcast. These Lebensborn were often very poorly treated at the end of the war because they were viewed as being collaborators. But anyway, this Baldur von Schirach was in charge of that program. Albert Speer, who you've heard of, replaced this guy named Todt, who was killed in 1942, and Speer became the armaments minister. He had previously been Hitler's architect. And then Arthur Seyss-Inquart was the Frank's deputy in Poland, and the governor of the Netherlands between 1940 and 1945, that was responsible for rounding up Jews and resistance members in the Netherlands. And then this Julius Streicher guy, who was a leading Nazi and a publisher of the magazine Der Stürmer. So these are the main people who were on trial in that first trial. So let us talk about now the legal basis for the trial, which was established by something called the London Charter, sometimes called the Nuremberg Charter. Of course, if you're going to have a trial, you better have some rules about it, right? We obviously have to have that. In August of 45, so really the month that the war ended, the Allies met in London to set down the rules for the procedures that they were going to use at Nuremberg. And they defined 4 categories of crimes. Crimes against peace, launching a war of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Obedience to orders, they said, would only be considered in mitigation of punishment if the tribunal determined that justice so required. The charter was drafted by Robert Jackson, who at the time was a member of the U.S. Supreme Court, Robert Falco from the UK, and Iona Nikitachenko, who was a Russian judge. And they were all also judges at Nuremberg. So let's take a look at the 4 different charges and where they came from. All right, let's start off with a crime against peace. Turns out that after World War I, the Allies were already trying to figure out how to cut down on the amount of mayhem during a war. They met in 1928 and formed what was called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And that was an arrangement where the parties solemnly declared in the names of their countries that they would condemn recourse to war for the solution of international controversies and to renounce it as an instrument of national policy in their relations with one another. And that was reaffirmed in Rome a few years later as part of the League of Nations when that was created. 71 countries signed that Kellogg-Briand Pact, including Germany, the US, Russia, Britain, France, and many others. Now, it had an interesting effect because this had to do with, if you didn't want to get charged with this crime, you better not violate that rule. So what happened? Countries stopped declaring war. Japan invaded Manchuria, no declaration of war. Italy invaded Abyssinia, no declaration of war. The Spanish Civil War, no declaration of war by either side. The Soviets invaded Finland, no declaration of war. The Germans and Soviets invade Poland, no declaration of war. How many wars have happened since where there's no declaration of war? You can all date back to this. And the other problem was, nowhere when they sat down to make this agreement did they ever discuss what the consequences would be if you were convicted of violating that pact. So that's the crime against peace. Let's talk about wars of aggression. After they did the crime against peace in 1933, they got together. And as a follow-up to the Kellogg-Briand Pact, they thought they would try to define what aggression meant. So here's what they said: a declaration of war upon a state or invasion by its armed forces, with or without a declaration of war of the territory of another state. But notice the way they say with or without a declaration of war. Attack by its land, naval, and air forces, with or without a declaration of war on the territory, vessels, or aircraft of another state. And also a naval blockade of the coasts or ports of another state. Okay, well, what happened? They met in 1933, not just 5 years after the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Already, the nations of the world after World War I were already at each other's throats. So the Russians signed, Poland signed, 2 or 3 others signed, but there's huge infighting. Lithuania won't sign if Poland is included. Now, there's a reason for that. The Poles are mad at the Lithuanians are mad at Poland. The country of Poland was carved out of the parts of Lithuania that were created after World War I. That's where the country of Poland came from. So these people are already getting mad at each other. And again, nowhere in the pact is there any agreement on what the consequences would be, let alone that nobody ever signed it except a few countries. War crimes. Well, war crimes actually have a much more interesting history. They date back to the Hague Conventions in 1899 and 1907, and a series of international treaties that came about as a result of our good friend, Teddy Roosevelt. You know, Teddy Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize. Did anybody know that? He negotiated peace between the Japanese and the Russians after they went to war in the Pacific Ocean in 1905, I think it was. And that's where this 1907 conference came from. And as a result of Teddy's Peace Prize and his desire to be an internationalist, there was a large number of conferences that were held where they would define what was a war crime. And they came up with a long list of rules, and many treaties were written, and they had a lot of participants. And nothing happened. It all just disappeared into the catacombs of history. The other part of this for crimes was crimes against humanity. Now, prior to World War II, no one had ever heard of something like a crime against humanity. So this came up at the London Charter. That was the meeting in London where the Allies met at the end of World War II. And this is what they said about a crime against humanity: murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts committed against any civilian population before or during the war, or persecutions of political, racial, and religious groups in execution of or in connection with any crime within the jurisdiction of the tribunal. They even referenced the Nuremberg tribunal in the rule. Whether or not in violation of the domestic law of the country where perpetrated. Meaning, the Germans were guilty of this, whether it happened in Germany or in Poland or any other country where they happened to do this. But they only came up with this in August of 1945. Now, if you were driving down the street in Austin, Texas, and you make a left-hand turn and drive over the top of somebody's grass and through their fence, you're almost certain to be charged with a crime. But how about if there's nothing on the books for that crime when you commit that offense? And then you then commit the offense, and then the policeman walks up to you and he says to you, you know, what you just did, I didn't like. So I'm going to write a law about that, and I'm going to charge you with violating that law, even though it wasn't a law and you did it. Well, you have a problem with that. And of course, this was really an issue during the tribunal. And it was especially an issue because at the end of the tribunal, Robert Jackson, the American lawyer from the Supreme Court, he wrote this general declaration at the end that basically it just flat out said, the Germans are guilty. That's the way it's going to be. You can read this yourself. Can everybody see this? Yeah. Okay, I don't need to read it. But basically, you launched an aggressive war, and even if we don't say that you're guilty of launching an aggressive war, these acts that you committed still constitute crimes against humanity. So they just said that was the way it's going to be, and that's the way it was. So that's what they did. Now, Robert Jackson, who, as I said, was a member of the Supreme Court, he led the U.S. prosecution along with a British prosecutor by the name of Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, who actually plays a very important role in this war crimes trial. Now, that's another interesting factor in this. Robert Jackson writes many of these rules, and then he's also part of the prosecution. That may or may not be a problem in most courts, but that might be a problem. Anyway, each defendant essentially had their own mini trial, and they had their own German attorney. The prosecutors rotated amongst the defendants. And the prosecution case was divided into two main phases. The first phase focused on establishing criminality of the Nazi regime, while the second sought to establish the guilt of each individual defendant. So they went after them one by one. The prosecution presented the case that each German invasion, starting with Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, Greece, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union, was a crime against peace and a war of aggression. The proof that the prosecution had was very nicely kept by the Germans themselves because they documented everything. So the prosecution merely provided the documents that the Germans had in their own files. And from here they went on to show how the Nazis used slave labor in the workforce and how they were running concentration camps and death camps. They used movies and witnesses. In December of 1945, U.S. prosecutor Thomas Todd, who wrote a very good book, by the way, on the Nuremberg war crimes trials, showed tanned human skin tattooed from concentration camp victims, preserved by concentration camp guard Ila Koch, the wife of the commandant of Buchenwald in Majdanek. She liked to have flesh fashioned into lampshades and other household objects for her home. Wouldn't she be a nice person to know? Then Todd introduced a fist-shaped shrunken head of an executed Pole that was used by Koch as a paperweight. On December 18th, the prosecution began introducing evidence to establish criminality of the Nazi Party leadership, the Reich Cabinet, the SS, the Gestapo, the SD, the SA, and the German High Command. Some of the evidence was so graphic that it brought cries and gasps from the spectators in the audience. British prosecutors sought to establish the criminality of the SS read an affidavit from a Dr. Sigmund Rascher, a professor of medicine. Actually, this story came up in one of our previous talks. He was a professor of medicine who performed experiments on inmates at Dachau. The affidavit described an experiment conducted to determine the best method to save German flyers pulled from freezing water in the North Sea. If you visit Dachau, photos of this experiment are on display in the museum there. Rascher ordered inmates stripped naked, thrown into tanks of freezing water, and they would just keep adding more and more chunks of ice as the workers repeatedly thrust thermometers into the rectums of the unconscious inmates to see if they were sufficiently chilled. Then the victims were pulled out of the tanks to see which of the three methods of warming might work best. The three methods of warming were to put them against one body, another slave laborer who was just meant to lie next to them, to put them against two slave laborers, one on either side, and then they had various tanks filled with varying degrees of warm water, and they tried all those different techniques of warm water, tepid water, and hot water to see if any of it would have an effect. He stated in his affidavit that most of the inmates used in the experiment just went into convulsions and died. Nothing useful was learned. Now, starting in January 1946, a series of concentration camp victims testified about their experiences. Marie-Claude Vallant, a 33-year-old French woman, provided testimony of what she saw at Auschwitz in 1942. She described how an orchestra of inmates played happy tunes as soldiers separated those destined for slave labor from those who would go straight to the gas chambers. She told of a night when she was awakened by horrible cries, and the next day when she woke up, she learned that the Nazis had run out of gas. Rather than just stop, they took the children and just hurled them into the furnaces while alive. On February 18th, Soviet prosecutors introduced a film entitled Documentary Evidence of German Fascist Invaders. You can see this movie actually if you go on YouTube, it's there. The film, which consisted mostly of captured German footage, showed Nazi atrocities accompanied by Russian narration. In one scene, naked women are forced into a ditch and then made to lie down as German soldiers, smiling for the camera, just shoot them all in the head. Now Göring, being the top Nazi on trial, he tried to become the de facto leader of the remaining 21. From the beginning of the trial, he took it on himself to direct the strategy of his co-defendants by sending them notes and notes to their lawyers, all from his position in the dock, with suggestions of issues to be raised, questions to be asked, and witnesses to be called. Göring his plan was for the Germans in the dock to try to present as united a front as possible, and he kept trying to get them to just deny everything. But he failed, and in the end, it became each man for himself. One example of why that happened was that Schacht, the banker, and von Neurath, the diplomat, they could not stand sitting or talking to Julius Streicher or SS Chief Kaltenbrunner, who they felt were the primary reasons why all of them were in so much trouble in the first place. So there was a lot of anger and animosity between some of them. Göring's personal vanity was evident throughout the trial. When testimony was presented about his penchant for looting artwork from occupied countries, he acted as if he was insulted. He denied that he stole anything. He said it was all gifts. He really thought that the Allies would find him innocent, and that he would be Germany's first post-war chancellor. That's really what he thought. He thought he'd be in charge of it. He thought he would end up in charge. When he was being questioned, he was able to quite effectively spar with Robert Jackson, the U.S. chief prosecutor. And it was during this period when things became so depressing that Churchill really began to question whether or not it was such a good idea to even have the trial in the first place. Now, Göring was totally unrepentant and refused to admit that he'd done anything wrong. During his testimony, he challenged Jackson on the validity of the trial, claiming it was a what? Victor's justice. His common refrain, we were all just following orders. We didn't do anything wrong. But the day before Göring's cross-examination, Rudolf Höss, the Auschwitz camp commandant, who had been recently captured, was dragged into court to testify and point to all the Nazis who had been to Auschwitz to see what was going on there, or who had been in the meetings where the issues of the final solution were being discussed. And his testimony totally deflated Göring, who must have realized that after the Höss testimony and the carnage that he described in Auschwitz in great detail, that his chance of living past the end of the trial was virtually non-existent. David Maxwell Fyfe from the UK took over from Jackson, and during the cross-examination of Göring, he finally got him to admit that he knew of the murders in the East, and that he'd also known and approved the Commissar order. And as I said before, that Commissar order was a singular one document that was responsible for getting over the film, or executed at the end of the war. Now here's a little video of Göring from a documentary movie that was made a few years ago where he's talking about all this. Let's see if we can get the moment.
I can just imagine the key questions, soldiers, and military. But I do not believe that the deliberately ordered the murder of women and children. Hitler was a psychopath. Hitler is ridiculous. That's lonely. Those numbers. It's
Can you
just
get more volume?
Yeah, sorry, that's all we've got. Can you read the subtitles? Yeah? That's all we got.
The trial now took an unexpected turn. There was a key Nazi left who could testify to the full scale of the Holocaust. The commandant of Auschwitz, on the run since the end of the war, was finally captured by the British. Recorded in his affidavit, he described how, in his camp alone, more than 1 million people were murdered.
I used to cycle on beating trucks to get to on a small boat. It took from 3 to 15 minutes. You knew when the people were dead because their screaming stopped. After the bodies were removed, special commandos took off the rings and extracted the gold from the teeth of the corpses. Children of tender years were invariably exterminated. Since by reason of their youth, they were unable to work. Is that all true and correct with this?
Yes. He was just another German who rode his fury.
It's a crime of such enormity
That's Robert Jackson.
One by one, Germany's top Nazis took the witness stand. The world waited to see whether they would follow Goering's example and steadfastly defend Hitler and Nazism.
Most devilish mass murder known to history. It's rooted by the crime which fills every German with shame.
Provoking this war was the greatest crime and the greatest madness Hitler has committed. One after the other, the defendants adopted different.
So that was really the end of their ability to provide a united front. They, at that point, all adopted each man for himself strategy, and that was really the end of their attempts to try to act as a united team. Now this man here, his name is Gilbert, and he also wrote a very interesting book. The Allies decided that it would be okay for them to send a psychiatrist in to talk to all of the Nazi defendants and talk to them during the course of the trial, and this was Gilbert's job. He was a psychiatrist. So he was having long, extended conversations with these guys every day, talking to them about what they felt and how they had acted during the war, and then they'd go back and have a meeting with the prosecutors, and it was all being discussed with the prosecutors. There's another strange aspect of something that you wouldn't normally see in trial. But anyway, it all ended with them ratting on each other, one each man for himself, and it sort of descended into a case where they were just trying to escape the hangman. Now the trial had a different impact on Albert Speer, the armaments minister. By the time he was under examination, he was ready to tell the court that all the terrible mistakes that he'd made, and he was guilty of many crimes. Rudolf Hess, the guy who'd flown to the UK, he had a strategy where he wanted to appear that he was completely and totally insane throughout the trial. He acted crazy on the stand. He would look at his feet, he would talk out loud, talk up to the ceiling, all kinds of crazy things. He thought that would keep him from having a date with the hangman. Under examination, he denied remembering anything about the war and said he didn't even recognize the other defendants. But he too eventually broke down under cross-examination, and he also admitted to being at many of the meetings with Himmler and Goebbels at the start of the war. What saved his life is the fact that he stole a plane, flew to Scotland in May of 1941, where he tried to negotiate peace with the British, an incident that reinforced the idea that he had a screw loose. Now some of the defendants just acted confused. They were the ones who were in denial about everything, desperately searching for any ray of hope, but generally incapable of defending themselves other than claiming that they were not important enough to have influenced state policy, so therefore they shouldn't be treated like these other ones. They thought it was all Himmler's fault, and he was dead, of course. Foreign Minister Ribbentrop was the one who took this position to the greatest extent. Now Hans Frank, he converted to Roman Catholicism after his arrest, and he said during his cross-examination, 1,000 years will pass, and the guilt of Germany will not be erased. The prosecution rested on March the 6th. After 33 witnesses and hundreds of exhibits, no one could deny that crimes against humanity had been committed by these indicted criminals. There were some interesting witnesses that are worth talking about. Admiral Horthy, the regent of Hungary, who resigned just as the Nazis began rounding up Hungary's Jews to be sent to Auschwitz, he was one of the witnesses for the prosecution. He testified about how the Nazis had rounded up Hungary's near 500,000 Jews in just 4 months in 1944 and sent them to Auschwitz. He opposed Germany's move to occupy Hungary and resigned in protest in 1944. He took off for Switzerland, but his son actually was arrested by the SS, and his son actually spent the rest of the war in Dachau with some of these other people. The Austrian pre-war Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg, by the way, aren't some of these names great? Schuschnigg is a great name. Who at first agreed to join Germany as an independent state, he soon found that Hitler had other ideas and simply wanted to absorb Austria into part of what he called the Greater German Empire. And when Schuschnigg figured this out, he resigned. And he also found himself spending the entire war first in Sachsenhausen and then Dachau. He was nearly murdered by Kaltenbrunner's SS at the end of the war when these 140 other notable hostages that Kaltenbrunner was trying to trade to the Allies, put him on a bus and sent him out into the Alps where he thought he could trade them to the Allies. Horthy's son was among this group, as was the Lutheran minister Niemöller, who we talked about a few lectures ago, also on that bus. Next week, when we talk about the resistance to Hitler, this is going to come up again. Anyway, Schuschnigg's testimony was particularly damaging to Göring and Van Papen, because those two had been the ones who convinced him that Hitler really wasn't interested in starting a war of aggression. Well, that proved out to not be the case. All right, so here's the outcome. These are the 21 defendants, and these are the different charges: crimes against peace, planning war of aggression, war crimes. The I means they were indicted, the G means they were found guilty. This was the penalty, and most of them who were found guilty were hung in 1946 all at the same time. Now, again, this war crimes was a guarantee. If you were going to get convicted of that, you were almost certain to be hung. The only people who didn't get it in the neck were the ones who actually ended up being so sick that they managed to avoid the hangman or committed suicide like Göring did. But that commissar order was the one thing that almost was a guarantee that they were going to get it in the neck. And this is the guy that did it. The hangman that worked for the U.S. Army was a guy by the name of John C. Woods. He was the executioner who executed all these men at Nuremberg, as well as some of the other war crimes trials we're going to talk about in a few minutes. He did about a total of 45 of these criminals. And he was from Wichita. Now, there's a few interesting things about our good friend John Woods. He wasn't exactly a model soldier. In 1929, he had joined the Navy and went AWOL, was discharged. He joined up again in 1943, but this time in the Army. And when the Army started looking for a hangman, he stuck up his hand. And he said, you know, I have a lot of experience in hanging people. And somebody who was actually looking for a hangman apparently wasn't too interested in checking references, because it turns out he totally lied. And he ended up executing 34 Americans who had committed various crimes in Europe before, during, and after the war. But he also executed these other people. But he was so bad at it that many of these people that he hung were left dangling at the end of the rope, suffocating, rather than actually being hung. Not that anyone cares too much about these Nazis who suffered a little bit on the end of his rope. Now, what's interesting is that this poor man was in a Weetalk in the Marshalls in 1950, and he accidentally electrocuted himself while he was working on some electrical systems in a Weetalk. But it turns out he was quite a character. Yeah. Now, let's go back and talk about this Rudolf Haas guy. As you saw in the little video, Haas testified about all these deaths that had been committed, murders that had been committed at Auschwitz from all these people from all these other countries, about 1.5 million people. He said at one point, I can no longer remember the figures for the small actions, but they were insignificant by comparison to the numbers below. Now, he ended up getting his own war crime trial. The Poles wanted him very badly because Auschwitz was also a Polish political prison, and the Poles were desperate to get their hands on him at the end of the war. They had a trial in 1947, and he was hung outside the crematorium at Auschwitz on April the 2nd of 1947. Now, that was it for the military tribunal set up by the four powers. The Allied powers also held an international military tribunal in Asia to try the Japanese who committed these same crimes. For the Asian trial, they expanded the number of judges from the manageable 4 that they had in Europe to a completely unmanageable 14 judges from 14 different countries. We're not going to talk about Asia today because it's so complicated, and we're not yet done with Europe, but there's a great documentary about the Asian war crimes trials that I'm going to have on my list and give you at the end of this lecture. All right, so let us move on. It turns out that after the IMT trial was completed, the four powers had 4 different reactions. Stalin wasn't really interested in having war trials. That's no surprise. He was still holding more than 200,000 German POWs. The few that survived the Gulag didn't return to Germany until the mid-50s. Another war crime unpunished, by the way. The French left before someone brought up their behavior of the Vichy. There was never a trial to hold the Vichy to account. There's never been a trial to hold the Vichy to account for anything, and certainly not for running their own concentration camp called Nutzweiler, which was in the hills up above Strasbourg. The British would go on to hold their own military tribunals in the British-occupied zone in Germany. And this is exactly what the U.S. ended up doing in the U.S. zone, also using the very same courthouse in Nuremberg. And they had those trials between 1946 and 1949. Now, here's a list of the ongoing U.S. tribunals that happened after the end of the main tribunal, the main trial. They had a doctor's trial, which were the doctors of the Action T4. That's the German euthanasia program, where they were taking handicapped people out of German sanitariums and murdering them right at the start of World War II because they felt that they had no way to contribute to the war effort, therefore they should just be eliminated. So they put those doctors on trial. There is something called the Milch trial. This was a trial of a guy named Erhard Milch of the Luftwaffe. We're going to talk about that one. That's an interesting one. The judge's trial was 16 jurists who had been part of this racial purity process during the 1930s. This is the, of course, famous basis of judgment at Nuremberg, the movie with Spencer Tracy. There's a Pole trial. Flick was a company. I.G. Farben, that's the son of the father who got off scot-free because he was in a coma. Well, the son got his own trial in 1947. There was a trial of SS generals who were involved in the Balkans campaign called the Hostages Trial. There's an RSA trial of racial cleansing and resettlement officials. Einsatzgruppen, they had their own trial. The Krupp trial, that's a trial about the company Krupp, which was the maker of much of the steel in Germany. A ministry's trial and a high command trial. Now, let's talk about just a couple of these. So the doctor's trial was about the T4 program. Again, they were charged with multiple different crimes. In fact, by this time, the Allies had decided that membership in the SS was now a crime. Now, it wasn't a crime in Germany to belong to the SS, but it became a crime at the end of the war to have been in the SS. This was, a little questionable, but this is what they did. And as you can see, a lot of these people were in the SS and were found guilty of that. Now, but I must say, in all fairness, most of them were committed, people who really deserved to get it in the neck for some of their other behaviors, including murdering all these 90-some-odd thousand handicapped people who were sent to their deaths, with these people doing most of the activity associated with that. And you can see that a lot of them were sent to their deaths. The interesting person who's not on this list, Mengele, the guy from Auschwitz, never tried, even in absentia, for some reason that history doesn't explain. Sorry?
In time,
He what?
Herbert Heim was another doctor, Dr.
Oh.
Death.
Oh, another guy? Yeah, well, is he on the list?
No.
No, right, so more than, okay, again, remember, room for 22 in the dock, right? So if there were others, perhaps they were left off the list because they didn't have room. Same courtroom, same problem. Okay, so again, this is the list of the tribunals that they held, a series of 12 trials. And here's one of the really interesting ones. There's one person who got their very own war crime trial, and it's this guy, Erhard Milch. And he was charged with crimes in slave labor, participating in fatal medical experiments, and slave labor and fatal experiments on Germans. Now, who was he? Turns out he was Göring's buddy from World War I. You know, Göring was a World War I ace, and he fought with Göring in World War I, and he became the Minister of Aircraft Supply, reporting directly to Göring. After the end of the war, he was defended by his brother, who also survived the war, and his trial was in 1947, from January to April. He was found guilty of these counts, count 1 and count 3. He put into jail. He appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court with a writ of habeas corpus, with a 4-4 ruling and Robert Jackson recusing himself. So he ended up staying put in prison. sentenced to 15 years. He was eventually paroled in 1954, which was about, what, 7 years later? This was a common problem, is that the United States and the Allies were desperately in need of getting help from Germany in keeping the Russians at bay during the start of the Cold War. And so many of these men managed to escape justice because the Allies needed to curry favor with the German population. Now, what was the really interesting part about Melch? He was Jewish. Now, how did that happen? Well, it turns out there was a ginormous fight about this guy. Before the war, when they were passing the Nuremberg laws, Himmler knew he was Jewish, and Himmler was out to get him. But Göring, who was trying to protect him because he was his buddy, he famously wrote Himmler a very stern letter saying, "I decide who's a Jew and who's not a Jew." So he just unilaterally declared that this Melch guy was not Jewish. He did it by making Melch force his mother to say that his real father wasn't his father, but that the mother's uncle, who was not Jewish, was really the father. So the mother wasn't Jewish, his mother wasn't Jewish, his father was Jewish, and they got the mother to sign a document saying that Melch's father wasn't his real father, but was some guy who was related to the mother. Anyway, Melch survived the war, and as did his brother for that matter, but he got his very own war crime trial. Okay, back to the remaining 12. The only other one I want to talk about is the I.G. Farben trial, because I.G. Farben's the company that was responsible for creating Zyklon B gas, and it was done so in the basement laboratories of this building in Frankfurt, which is now part of the Johann Goethe University. And this building can be visited today. It's a student building, an enormous building. And out in front of it, they have placed this ginormous brass plaque, which is sitting right here next to the front entrance, which explains the role of the building in the course of the war. Now, as a student going to this university, walking into this building and seeing this plaque here, one might have some trepidations about using that building as but it was so built in such a manner that they decided not to tear it down. It's enormous, it's a huge building. And actually it was used by Eisenhower as his headquarters after the war. So it was used by 5 Corps for many years after the war, as well as an Army headquarters. So it's been in use for a long time. And they got their own trial. The directors of Farben were charged with these crimes, 24 defendants, 10 of them were acquitted, 13 were found guilty, and 1 was dismissed because he was ill. They, as I said, were the Zyklon B manufacturer, and they had also been in charge of building this huge new plant at Auschwitz called Monowitz, where they were supposed to make synthetic fuel and synthetic rubber, but they never got it into production. However, the process of building the building was so nasty that hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of people were killed, and several of the directors were given long prison sentences for their activities at Monowitz. What's interesting about I.G. Farben is that the government of the United States decided to make a point of I.G. Farben after the war, and they broke the company out into some very famous companies that you've heard of. Yeah? So when you buy aspirin, that's really made by a company that came up as a result of I.G. Farben. Some of these companies have merged themselves out of existence, but BASF is still around, and AGFA used to be a film manufacturer. Anyway, they had a 50-year fight with the shareholders of I.G. Farben, the original shareholders, the pre-war shareholders, over the fact that the Allies just unilaterally broke up the company as a result of the war crimes trial and split it up, and the shareholders, who had been shareholders previously, got nothing. And they've had a fight about it in court ever since. The original company at one point paid a 500,000 Deutschmark fine or a donation for war reparations, but none of that would resolve the issues. And even today, or at least up until a few years ago, they were having annual meetings which drew protesters from the German public who were still sitting on shares of I.G. Farben. So that project and that problem still continued on. Now, on top of all those trials, there were also a bunch of trials for the various camps. There was an Auschwitz trial, a Belsen trial by the British. The Poles had a trial in Poland. And the Germans had their own trial about Belzec. in Munich in 1963. There were two Helmholtz trials, one by the Soviets and another by the Poles. Dachau trial, very famous Dachau trial by the U.S., where they put 1,672 war criminals on trial, 1,416 convictions, and 297 death sentences. That's probably the biggest one. But there were other trials, as you can see, that went all the way down here, and with all various different degrees of results. By the time some of these trials were going on, the public was losing interest. The Allies needed the Germans to help them with the Russians. So nobody really had their heart in it like they might have done in 1945 when this was done. With one exception, along came a guy named Fritz Bauer. And Fritz Bauer decided, he was a prosecutor in Frankfurt for the state of Hesse, or Saxony, no, Hesse, the state of Hesse. And he wanted to put people from Auschwitz, prison guards on trial from Auschwitz, as a way to show the German people, the new generation of German people, that the German people had committed all these crimes during the war, because at the time he felt that the youth in Germany was forgetting the crimes of their parents. And he spent a great deal of time pulling this trial together, but even he ended up very unhappy. Most of the people who were convicted only got a few years, with a few getting a life sentence. Now, Fritz Bauer has been the subject of several movies recently. Labyrinth of Lies, which is one you may have seen that came out just last year. And then I'm going to point you in the direction of this movie on Amazon Prime, The People versus Fritz Bauer, which was even better. Turns out Fritz Bauer is the guy who tipped off the Israelis about Eichmann being present in Argentina in the early 60s, and was responsible for having him returned to Auschwitz. Okay, so these Nuremberg trials, they live on even to today. We have the United Nations Charter, which includes many of these provisions, which came from the previous work that had been done by the International Military Tribunal. Multiple Geneva Conventions have been ongoing since World War II that have further tried to define war crimes and crimes against humanity. Of course, the International Criminal Court is an attempt by the countries of the world to have a place to try people who have committed crimes against large numbers of people. We have, of course, a number of nuclear test ban treaties and nuclear treaties in general, which have grown out of the idea that countries need to get along. We have a treaty on prohibiting chemical weapons and many other international accords. But, are they really all that effective? And it's up to you to decide, and really, it falls to everybody on this planet to decide what the lessons of the International Military Tribunals were in Nuremberg, and what the subsequent behavior of the people on this planet has been since then. We still have genocide, we still have war. Have we learned very much? Well, I'm not sure. So, and at that point, I'd like to hear what some of you have to say about it.
Questions?
And comments, too.
Questions, comments?
A question here. I guess a question.
Anybody?
When we were in Nuremberg, we went to the tribunal and we noticed on the wall there was a crucifix.
Yes.
And it was put there in 1967, and when I asked the guide why, I got not an answer at all. Do you have any idea why that's there?
No. I don't. Yeah, sorry.
Would you comment some more on the I was only following orders defense? I just finished a book about the capture of the German submarine U-505, and the book was written by the captain of the American warship that captured that submarine.
Yes.
And the last chapter of the book, I was very surprised. He spent the whole chapter expressing his outrage that, I think it was Donitz, he was outraged that Donitz had been tried at all because, in his opinion, he was just following orders.
Well, so this is the problem, right? Donitz was a military man. He was obviously told to go and execute the orders that he was given. I think that it always comes into great question when you find out that Karl Dönitz was also telling his U-boat commanders to shoot at the life rafts filled with survivors who managed to get off the ships that his submarines had sunk. So it's true that some of their actions were merely the actions that men take in war, which are, you're given an order, you follow it. But that doesn't mean that you should be giving orders to kill the people that survived the sinking of the ships that you're sinking, which is what they were doing and what they did do. So this is one of the things that they were claiming that Dönitz had been involved with, as well as Eric Rader for that matter. And of course, Dönitz had also been involved in planning the war. So let's not forget that he was a high-ranking Nazi party official too. It wasn't just that he was on trial for what he'd done as a Navy commander.
They treated him very lightly, as I recall.
Yes, that's right. He was not executed.
10 years.
10 years, yeah. And Gallery, that's the guy who wrote that book, right? The U-505 commander, wasn't that his name?
Yes, Dan Gallery.
Dan Gallery. So you know the story about that. Well, you have to know the story about that. The story about that is that when did they capture the U-505? Do you know the date? June?
44.
Well, what date in June? June 4th, 2 days before D-Day. Now, Gallery was on an aircraft carrier in a task force that was cruising around off the Azores looking for U-boats, and the orders came out from wherever orders come from in the U.S. Navy. You can sink as many U-boats as you want, but under no circumstances are you to try to board a U-boat. Now, why do you think they said that? They were, of course, preparing for the D-Day invasion, and the last thing they wanted to do was to have the Germans find out that the Americans were going after the Enigma machines inside the U-boats. So the orders were, go ahead, you can sink as many U-boats as you want, but under no circumstances try to capture one. And what did Gallery do? He captured U-505 and kept it above the water, which allowed his guys to go in and get the Enigma machines in the code books. He was almost court-martialed for that, because they were so mad that they, if the Germans had sent a message, hey, we're under attack and these guys are after the Enigma machine, the Allies might have gone dark during D-Day. And what a disaster that would have been, because they were reading the Germans' mail. So Gallery got into a lot of trouble for that. But he did bring that U-boat to Chicago, which has made it into a fantastic world-class museum, especially now that it's inside, right? It's a great place. Yeah.
You have made this live for us, and I wonder if, I know you've read enormously, would you post some books and films
Yes.
on the website?
As a matter of fact, after this slide, wait. So I have a list that I made from each of the subjects, movies and books. And this afternoon before I came here, I was going to print these out and put them on a piece of paper so that you could all take this list home. But
Perhaps next week.
yeah, I'll bring it next week.
Or there's a website that we have that maybe that could be posted on the
Oh.
website?
You can send
There's an
them to
OLLI
Mark.
website?
You can send them to Mark. yes.
Okay, fine, I'll do that. Okay, fine. So I'll send them to Mark and he'll post them for you, because I have a list. Somebody asked me about this last week, and so I sat down and I made a list of all the books and movies that you could go look at that I've read, or more recently read, on these various subjects. Yeah. Yeah.
Is Europe any less anti-Semitic now than it was before the war?
Well, I wasn't there before the war. But I can imagine what it was like. So, yes, I can say without a doubt that Europe, Germany, wait a minute, let me answer this question country by country. Germany learned their lesson. I am endlessly impressed when I go to concentration camps in Germany, and you know I've been to very many of them. They all have museums, and invariably when I visit those camps, there are a lot of German families there, often with their little kids, taking them through the museums, somberly looking at everything that was done by their grandparents or their great-grandparents, whoever they were, and taking it all in. I think those people have done everything they possibly can to learn their lesson. Now, I cannot say that's true about every country. And certainly what you read in the news is certainly accurate. In some countries, anti-Semitism has seen resurgence in France, in Poland, in some of these other Eastern European countries. You know, it's never very far under the surface. In fact, you always know, you always will know, throughout history, when things get bad, out come the knives, and they start looking for somebody to blame. And unfortunately, Jews are often the primary target for that. It probably isn't likely to change anytime soon. Yeah.
Am I hallucinating, or do I remember a Nuremberg trial where the defendant was kept in a cage?
You're thinking of the Eichmann trial. In Israel, they took Eichmann from Argentina, they kidnapped him, grabbed him, took him back to Israel, and he sat in a bulletproof cage during the course of his trial because they were worried he might be shot. So they put him in a glass bulletproof cage. I think is that what you're thinking of? Yeah. But in the Nuremberg trials that you saw there, they just had a bench. So they weren't in a cage there.
In 1960 to 63, I was stationed in Germany outside of Nuremberg at an Intel collection site. And the focus at that time was to build the German economy to counter the Russian forces that were very significant in East Germany. So we were trying to build up Germany, and we were not worrying too much about the
100% the reason why most of these people got away with it. Because had the Russians not created a threat to the West at the end of the war, there would have been more of an effort to round up the criminals from Germany. But
I'm sure.
Yes, there's no doubt about it. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And the same is also true in Japan. The Japanese story is very similar in that we needed to curry favor with the Japanese population as a counterbalance against Soviet expansion in the Pacific. Same story, exact same story. Oh yeah.
I just was looking at the films, and I didn't see the original Spencer Tracy film on the Nuremberg. Is it one of those listed?
Oh, here it is.
Judgment at Nuremberg, right.
Where is it?
I don't see it.
I don't see it.
No.
Well, it should be on there.
Yeah.
Now, what is on there is this book by Gilbert, G.M. Gilbert. He is the psychiatrist that you saw in that movie with Goring, and also Telford Taylor, who was also the guy who was, you probably don't remember, but he was reading the Haas testimony. And then this Ben Ferenz is still alive, and he was the prosecutor at one of the trials. I'm not sure which one, but he's written a lot extensively on the trials. But Judgment at Nuremberg is a great movie. There's no doubt about it. I guess I probably left it. I'll add it by next week because it's a great movie.
Yes. Was there ever any formal international judgment on the complicity of the German population, include the identification of Jewish people who've been shipped off to camps?
Yeah, so any collective guilt of the German people themselves?
Formal.
Well, I tell you what they did do. They formally agreed to pay reparations. The German government has paid billions in reparations for the Germans, for the German Jews who had their property expropriated and their lives obviously taken, to their relatives if they could find them. They've paid reparations to Israel as a way to make amends. And they've paid reparations even for some of their actions in Eastern Europe. But the Poles are furious still to this day to the Germans because the Germans never paid any reparations to Poland per se. So there's still a lot of unfinished business. But to specifically go after your question, in some cases they did try to make reparations, but no formal trial or anything like that. Right? How could you do that? Yeah.
I'm wondering what happened to Edward Milch, the Nazi Jew.
Yeah.
Is he still alive?
He died. Of course, it's a long time ago already. So, but he lived to a ripe old age. I think he died in the 60s or it might have been the 70s. You can look up his history, but he survived the war. He was let out of jail in, 54, and he lived to a ripe old age. I'm sure he wasn't very welcome at his family dinners, though. You can rest assured that his family dinners were a source of considerable discussion. He probably was not a welcome member of the family at that point. Even though his brother defended him, right? His brother defended him at the end of the war. So maybe they're okay. I mean, after all, he probably helped save them, right? The reality is that Milch's relationship with Goring may very well have been the reason, the only reason, that the rest of his family survived. So maybe they're lucky. Yeah?
I have two questions. First, do you know what Leon Jaworski's role was during the Nuremberg trials? I believe he was on one of the legal staffs.
I don't know that name.
So why they prosecuted?
Oh, okay, I do know that name. Yeah, but I didn't know he was at Nuremberg. Was he William Shatner? William Shatner, you know the actor?
Yeah.
He was on staff there during the movie Justice at Nuremberg, that great movie that we're all talking about. He was in that movie. Maybe that was William Shatner.
I have no idea.
Oh, I don't know.
But the other thing, you were talking about the West Germans, or the Germans making war reparations.
Yes.
Do you know what the status of Billy Joel's effort to get his family's property in East Berlin returned?
No idea. Billy Joel's family has property in East Berlin?
His family owned the biggest department store in Berlin.
Oh.
And when his family left Germany, they basically had their property stolen from them.
Yeah.
They were impoverished when they moved to New York.
Really? Okay. I didn't know that. There's something
We've all heard of the Diary of Anne Frank.
Yes.
There's this month's Smithsonian Magazine has a long article about a young Polish girl who suffered much the same as Anne Frank did. It's a heartrending story to read, and it goes on for many pages with her diary being listed there.
When was that written?
Good reading, and that's the current issue of Smithsonian.
And when was her diary written?
When?
Well, I mean, did she write the diary during the war like Anne Frank did?
Yes, she was 15 and 16 to 18 years old, living in Poland, a small village, I don't remember the name of it, but she was living there, and then finally, after the Russians had come in, they let her continue, or her family continue to live. And then finally, near the end of the war, they decided to wipe out all the Jewish families in Poland. And that was her final ending. Very, very tragic story.
6 million tragic stories, with all 6 million ending in ash, right?
This one's a little more personal with her writing of it.
The book, right? Yeah. Good. That sounds interesting.
I just want to comment, I've read quite a bit, and you had Dietrich Bonhoeffer's book, was this?
Yes. Well, it's
not there.
Eric. Oh, it's because it was for the resistance to Hitler. Hang on. This one. Here it is. Here. This book.
Right. Yeah, excellent book.
Yes, it is.
At any rate, that points out sort of the way the German people generally looked at what was going on at that time. It's a very interesting kind of outlook.
Yes.
That you can examine.
That's our subject for next week, is the resistance to Hitler. And Bonhoeffer's entire family was really quite unique in that history, which is detailed in great detail in that. The tax.
The other side of that coin is that a lot of the population looked at, this is the way it is because they're established the power people of the government, and that's it.
It's very difficult to stand up against a government that is willing to cut your head off when you protest. This is what was going on. 15,000 Germans were guillotined. We're going to talk about that next week. I don't want to get ahead of myself. I give up all my good stuff this week. You won't come next week. But 15,000 Germans were guillotined who were resisting Hitler. Sorry?
That's the teaser for next week.
That's the teaser, that's right. And we're going to have a guillotine right here.
About a year or two ago, I found a book in the half-price book called Exorcising Hitler, the Occupation and Denazification of Germany. And it was really an interesting book. And one of the things they talked about was the Allies didn't want to arrest every Nazi who was in government jobs.
Right.
Because there would be no civil servants. Most of the civil servants were members of the party. And so they wanted things to continue to run, and the lesson was, if we had done that in Iraq, you know, there would have been the chaos that there was there. But it's a good book, and it was also talks about how badly the Germans were treated after the war, and how many people starved, and
Yeah.
those kinds of things.
It's interesting that that's a good example that you brought up, that the Americans did put the SS, tacitly or otherwise, back into positions of civil, in their civil service, because these people actually knew how to make the country run. If you got rid of all of them, who was gonna run the country? And as you pointed out, this is perhaps one of the big mistakes we made when we were in Iraq, and what we call it, de-Baathified the place, right? Those people were the very same types of creeps, just like the Nazis, but they knew how to make the place run. So they fell apart. Anyway, wait, before we go, I want to show of hands. The question is about justice. Did we get a measure of justice from the war crimes trials, the way we held them? Should we feel proud of how the way we meted out justice to the Germans, but sort of forgot about it for everybody else? What do you think? Show of hands. Yes or no? Justice or no? Justice? Worth it anyway, right? Right? Yes. Nothing's ever perfect, right?
Richard, thank you very, very much.
Thank you for coming.